Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third online Driver Arts Driver seminar, roundtable, webinar. I use these words interchangeably. I really should be consistent. We're really delighted to be exploring the theme of lobbying, or more how people use data in order to influence or persuade or make a case, and particularly how the kind of relationship between businesses and entrepreneurs and policymakers and decision makers who are tasked with making big decisions, but often rely on data that's questioned. And many businesses, entrepreneurs are collecting huge amounts of data and don't always know quite what to do with it, and that's what we're going to explore, and I'm excited to be doing that. So quick little bits of housekeeping. As usual, we will keep people muted for the beginning bit, other than those that are invited to talk, but then for the sort of second half of the session, we will have an open conversation in which you're very free to either raise a hand or write something in the chat bar and we bring you in, or just blurt something out. I think we'll be a small enough group that that's okay. There'll be a few people joining live, which is great. There's some people still joining, and there'll be some people accessing this later on the recording. So I'm Richard from Always Possible, and you're very welcome to put your name and who you are in the chat bar if you want to connect with others. Or when you do have a chance to contribute and talk later, just let people know where you're from. That would be great. So some of you will have been involved with Driver Arts Driver so far. It's been a fantastic roller coaster of a project looking at superfusion, creativity, technology, and business for over a year now. Lots and lots of different events and exhibitions and research initiatives, bringing together the idea of data and creativity and what that might do for business innovation. Obviously, the lockdown has meant us having to think a little bit differently about how we do these events, but it has also given us some new conversations to have, I think, which has been really exciting. Now, we don't want today's conversation to be all about COVID-19, but it's a very real backdrop, and the conversations that we're all having about data and how we use it have possibly never been more at the forefront of our thinking in terms of what the decisions governments are making and the sort of decisions that businesses are making. So that will be there, and you're welcome to draw on that. Those of you who haven't explored the driverartsdriver.com website, then I encourage you to do so. And I'll put this link again at the end. Driver Arts Driver is a University of Brighton led project funded by the European Regional Development Fund and the Arts Council England. There's a huge amount of resources on the website, also lots of people who have been involved in the project that you can connect with, from data researchers to artists to business leaders. And you can also book resources and support directly from the university to explore ideas. So please do visit that site, and I'm delighted to this afternoon we're joined by Donna Close, who is one of the project leaders, so I'm sure she'll be happy to answer any questions if anyone has anything about the project as a whole towards the end of the session. So as I said, I'm Richard from Always Possible. We're the events partner for the Driver Arts Driver project, and my glamorous assistant Vicky is working behind the scenes to make sure that everyone here is all right and in the right place. And we are recording this session so that people can access it later. So if for any reason you're uncomfortable with that, or don't want to appear on it, or anything that you contribute you want to have taken out, just let us know. But otherwise, I think we'll probably crack on. So I gave a little kind of spark there around what we're thinking about today, lobbying and the use of data for persuasion and for change. And what I'm most excited about this session is we've got three really exciting practitioners and experts who've got very different perspectives on this and have different experiences that I think they're going to throw into the pot like a virtual hand grenade, with some great examples of where they've seen data been used well to make change and also where it hasn't. So I'm really excited to invite them and thank them very much for their time. So we're going to hear from Dr. Peter Bleackley, who is the founder of Playful Technology, his own consulting company, but he's also an astrophysicist and a computer scientist, data scientist. Worked with a number of startups and open source data science projects. He'll tell you a little bit more about himself and his work now. So Peter, over to you.
Hello. So what I'd like to say today is that people in positions of power are usually all in favour of data science as long as it tells them what they wanted to hear. And if it doesn't, they're very often quite tempted to shoot the messenger. So towards the end of my career at the BBC, I got a bit of a poisoned chalice, the boss's pet project. And it quickly became apparent that the thing I was trying to do would only ever work on the Antiques Roadshow. Unfortunately, my boss at the time didn't have much faith in me, and I couldn't persuade him that I ought to be doing something better with my time. Now, a couple of years ago, I had another project that wasn't going to work. I was working for a sportswear company, and they wanted to recommend swimming goggles to people based on 3D scans of their faces. Now, again, after a few weeks' work on that, trying different data science methods, it became clear that there was no useful correlation between the data they had and the thing they wanted to predict. So I advised them to close that project down. However, in that case, A, because they'd brought me in as a consultant to be the one who was telling them what to do, and B, because I'd engaged with them and shown them how I'd reached that conclusion as I went along. They had bought into that. They were invested in my decision. So the thing I want to say is that we have to be more than data scientists. We have to be data storytellers. We have to engage with the clients and bring them on board so that in the end, what they want to hear is what we have to tell them. And that, I think, is how we influence people with data.
Thank you very much. Short, sharp, and like a bullet. Very clear. Thank you very much. We must tell stories with our data in order to be heard, which is a common theme that we've been exploring, but absolutely right. Thank you very much, Peter. We'll come back to you in a little while. I'm going to introduce now Bonami Waddell. Bonami is an expert in data and marketing. After many years working in the corporate world, she is now an independent research data and insights consultant, and has been doing some really, really interesting things looking at the needs, the immediate needs of businesses in the Sussex area and how that can be used to lobby government for emergency support, which she's going to draw on amongst other things. So Bonami, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I was just following on from what Peter said, really. Data storytelling really is my focus, and how we can use data to present evidence to influence change, whether it's within organisations and sort of wider than that. I think during this lockdown period in particular, I've been involved in 3 projects that have really shown how this can happen, and I think it's for me, these have all been survey related, and I know there's often debates about surveys are dead and long live the survey sort of thing. But in this particular case, it's really helped to amplify the voice of individuals into a collective, if you like, to drive that change. So just briefly, these three examples. One was a membership-based organisation. They're a science membership-based organisation with over 20,000 members. They have a flagship annual event which they bring together thousands of members for once a year. And their challenge really was, during this time of COVID, how do we flip from being a face-to-face conferencing offer to virtual conferencing? So rather than sitting down, they formed a virtual experience team within the organisation, but rather than kind of navel gazing within themselves and putting out theories that they thought were right, they went out to their members and said, what is it that you want from a conference? What is it that we've offered in the past? And what is it that has worked in other virtual forums that we can learn from and then build from? And within a week, their responses, they had about 7% response rate from their members, and they used that as the basis to form their plan, really, of how they now pivot into virtual conferencing. And I think without that, it would have just been a handful of people within the organisation, 8 or 10 people, just saying what they felt was right. And actually, they got a very clear response from their survey to give them the direction that they needed, and also to present back to the leadership team, really, why they felt this was the right strategy and why this was the right sort of focus to take. Another example was a PR agency wanted to understand the mental health and well-being of their employees during this time. Obviously, working from home has been a challenge or an issue, if you like, for quite a number of organisations. But under the pandemic, it's gone from people saying, I'd like to work flexibly, to everybody having to work from home. And it's presented a whole range of problems that organisations had very little time to prepare for. And so they used a survey amongst their employees to get a sense of what the challenges were that people were facing, aside from the obvious ones, really, I suppose, that people were reading in the news. This gave them a really strong set of responses which they could act on, and that, again, the leadership team could show that they were really supporting their employees by hearing what they were saying. So in one particular case, 42% of them were saying that they were struggling with physical equipment, because suddenly working from home, if you're used to spreadsheets, for example, you don't want to be staring at a tiny laptop screen, or if you're working from the kitchen table, you're then suffering from backache. And there were a number of challenges that were being faced, and one person telling their line manager about this may not have had the same influence as 42 people out of 100 saying that this was a challenge for them. And so on the back of that, they were able to support their teams directly and be able to help them. And then the final project was, as Richard touched on, was how to give a collective voice to small businesses in Sussex on the impact of COVID-19. And this came about, there were a number of about 15 or so organisations who are Sussex-based who were getting feedback from their members or from their clients or from different sources about the challenges that they were facing and what the impacts were on small businesses during COVID-19. So they created a survey early mid-May, so right in the midst of the pandemic, with the aim of giving these small businesses a platform to voice their challenges in order to understand what immediate support they might require. They went out to all their local audiences, and 350 small businesses responded. 96% of those said that they reported a negative impact on their business within the first 3 months. There's a full report that's available, but the point of this was, it was rather than a single SME trying to voice their challenges, they were able to talk as a collective, and the results were shared by West Sussex County Council with central government, and helped to shape subsequent responses, such as the new discretionary, the then new discretionary grant fund, and also the results being used to help shape the rebound and rebuild strategy for the Sussex area. So 3 quite different examples, but the point being that when we talk as a collective, using surveys to give us that evidence, has been a powerful way to make changes happen within organisations and beyond.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bonami. Really, really helpful. And again, something I want to draw upon later. Our third, but certainly not lastly but not leastly, that's the phrase, speaker is Dr. Hedda Raza from the University of Essex Data Centre and the Business and Local Government Data Research Centre. A computer science and engineer by training, but latterly lots of interest I see through your research in neural systems and neurotechnology and the healthcare world. So thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. So as Richard has introduced me, and from training, I'm a computer scientist, but my all skills are applicable to businesses, helping small businesses and healthcare within the Essex area and nationally and internationally as well. So I would like to quote basically 3 examples how we make sense of the data which exist within the system and the small businesses and the organizations don't know means these data is helpful for them. So the first example is that with Essex Police, right? So we did an innovation voucher, which is one of the functions, or you can say one of the facility provided by our BLG Big Data Center. So we do innovation vouchers where you can explore the feasibility of a large scope project, or means the feasibility of a project. So the small businesses and public sectors, they come to us with their problems and their challenges, and we see by using their data what we can do. So similarly, Essex Police came up with a problem that the properties within the Essex area which are being left or sold out or alone for quite a long period of time, there is a possibility of happening risky businesses within those homes, such as drug dealings or some type of crimes, or means any kind of risky businesses, right? So Essex Police have the data that because of this right move and Zoopla and other thing, that which properties are being emptied for a couple of period of time. So we build a data scrapper, and we help Essex Police in identifying, or you can say bringing into their knowledge that these properties are empty for like 2 to 3 months or maybe 6 months. So a possibility that means a frequent patrolling or keeping an eye on these properties will help like to reduce these in the businesses. And what we have seen means they have implemented this, and they said that they will able to track this, and means they put a positive impact on this, their search and operations. Second thing which we did is again that is related to healthcare basically. So here within the NHS center, so there is a care coordinator center. So the problem is this: it's very difficult to coordinate with the people who are elderly or who keep moving from homes here and there. So basically when someone goes to GP, they refer to some kind of clinicians. So there are 3 categories of that, like urgent appointment, soon appointment, or means a routine appointment kind of thing, right? So there is a issue of triaging systems, like because this care coordinating center have all the information within their organization, but they don't have a machine, or you can say a intelligent, a robotic process, automated process weight machine, which can decide that where and where to send a referral to a people, right? So what we did, we talked, in this project, we have a AI data scientist who's working under my supervision, and we have a psychology team because we need to interact with the people to understand their need, right? So initially we are in the 2nd year of that project, and what we did, we have created an intelligent online referral system. So where people can self-referral to themselves. So right, for example, if somebody got a referral, that means that, for example, I'm feeling a back pain, right? And for that back pain, I book an appointment with the doctor, and the appointment will take maybe 2 weeks or maybe 6 months, right? Because there is a long queue in musculoskeletal department. So what we do, you can self-refer to yourself, and you will get a package in a digital form where we will recommend you some form of exercises, some form of, and the decision which we are giving you, what we are referring you, it's being made intelligently because we are tracking your information, the data we have from the past. So we only refer you by mapping your information with the existing knowledge. So what happened within few months, like just after 5 or 6 months, we have seen a drastic drop in booking an appointment or missing an appointment. Because, like, you know, people are not missing their appointments because they don't have to move. And in this situation of COVID, you can't go to clinic or you can't go to the clinicians. So they can self-refer themselves and everything come to them digitally. So it means this is how we are making sense of the data. Thank you.
Thank you. Really, really interesting. Thank you to all three of you. I think you'll agree some great food for thought there, and three very sort of different, connected but different angles. Peter saying you could have the best, most reliable and exciting and accurate data in the world, but unless you frame it in a way that people are willing to hear about it, then that it might not persuade those that make the decisions. Bonamy making the case there for collective data and bringing a number of different data sources together in order to find that clarity, and that's far more valuable than individual threads. And Hedda there making the point around how do we use existing data that is there to be far more intelligent in the way that it solves present and future problems. Perhaps we already have the tools, we just need to get people to use them more intelligently. So some really interesting food for thought there that I'd now like to explore with everybody. Before I open up the conversation wider, and I've got a few questions that I'd like to explore with our panel, but also with all of you. Could you type your yes or no answer to this in the chat bar? So considering what kind of organization, either do this from an organizational point of view or from an individual point of view, do you think that the data that you possess or create or generate could be an untapped source for helping to make the case for change? Not going to prescribe what that change might be, but do you think that your data is not being used as much as it could be, that it's an untapped source for helping to make the case for change? So again, either as an individual or as an organization, we're just interested to see what you think. Drop your thoughts in the chat, and then we'll return to that a little bit later. So while you're doing that, I'm going to move on to our first set of questions to think about as a room. And we're going to focus on the policymakers, their attitudes, behaviours, what is influencing them, how are they coming to make their decisions based on the data available. And there's three questions I want us to think about. So do policymakers know how to use business data for long-term planning? So a great example there in Essex, you know, if we're thinking about how a police and crime commissioner, for example, is helping the police to direct resources and to spend budgets, would they know how to use Rightmove and Zoopla data as a source for better understanding how properties are being used? You know, that's a great example. Or how do policymakers use data to make decisions more broadly? Bonamy gave a great example there of the case West Sussex made to government around funding. But what do we know about those decision-making processes? Are they transparent enough? What kind of data are they relying on? Is some of it being ignored? And then thirdly, maybe there's some examples that we've got here within the room of what policy change you think has come about directly as a result of specific data being used, and where that decision was data-led rather than politically led or economically led or led by convenience. I'd like us to explore some of those. So I'd like you, so if you've got a point to raise or of interest, please just kind of virtually put your hand up in the chat room, or raise your hand or switch your camera on. and we'll bring you into the conversation. But first, I might come back to Bonamy first, if that's okay. I think I'm quite interested in so that end project that you talked about, where you said there were 15 organisations that collected that survey data about small businesses.
Mm.
Why did those 15 organisations not do their own surveys individually, and what would have happened if they did, do you think?
I think in this case, a lot of them are member organisations, and actually they're working somewhat in silos in our everyday life, but actually they saw the benefit of collaborating in this way. And I think everyone's trying to attract members, whether they're co-working spaces or chambers, and I think they can operate quite locally. But I think they realise the benefit of being sort of broader than East or West Sussex and actually opening this up to the whole region. Mm-hmm. So I think it made it more powerful. I think, I think it was recognised that this wasn't about operating in isolation. This was about what can we do to get the best support for our area, given that it's very heavily SME based as well.
And is that common, or in your experience, do you, as a sort of data insights guru yourself, do you find that people are competing to get their data in front of the right people, even if it's not perhaps as inclusive or as broad as it could be if they collaborated with others? I don't know, but it's a question.
I mean, I haven't often worked with numbers of organisations in this way, but actually often you can reapply that as one team within an organisation. So I think it might be, say, the internal comms team trying to get their case across an organisation. And I think the danger is that, to what Peter said, in a sense, unless the organisation as a whole is broadly open to hearing what you're going to interpret, then it can be tricky. And so therefore there's a danger that you might present back within a team, and then it's how do you get the rest of the organisation on board. And actually I'm doing a talk about it, a workshop in a couple of weeks on exactly that. How can internal comms teams use research and data to inform their strategy, but that gets brought into across a wider audience, and I think sometimes that's the problem. And I think the other area, just in terms of on your questions, is time in a lot of cases. I think the benefit of bringing in consultants is time. I think the police force might well have known where to look and how to go about it, but they might not have had the time and resource to do it, and so they needed Hader and his team's expertise to get involved.
Yeah. But that presumably then is a planning failure. If there's not enough time, it's because that time has not been recognized. That thinking has not been recognized as something that will be of use.
Yeah, and I think it can be pulled in quite often. It's, oh, hang on, we need to use data here. It's not. It's. I mean, you can see in the last three to 5 years how chief data officers and that sort of title role has been brought into organisations, and I think it's shifting from pulling in someone on a project basis to actually recognising the need for continual benchmarking and reviewing of data along the way. But I think in certain cases it is still thought of as and is relevant in some cases as being a sort of project-based requirement.
Thank you. Peter, coming back to you there, I guess you are that expert for hire.
Yes.
Going into businesses and giving that time and knowledge. But first thing I want to ask you, there's some great questions and statements on the chat there. I'm going to bring John in a moment. He seems very cynical about the ability of policymakers to listen. But my question to you, and you said, you've got to frame something in the way that decision makers want to hear it. In your experience, what do they want to hear?
I mean, they obviously a lot of the time they want results, which is the but they also. They have to, obviously the results aren't necessarily going to be what they want. So that's kind of why they have to be involved in the process, and know what the expert is doing. So, I mean, recently I was working with Amy Strategic Consulting on behalf of Highways England. So we were regularly connecting with stakeholders in Highways England to make sure that they understood what we were doing with their data and how we were trying to create value for them out of it. I noticed John H's thing about policymakers have a narrow view and generally do not understand statistics, and that's kind of where the data storyteller comes in. I mean, for example, with my swimming goggles project that I was telling you about earlier, I used a TSNE, which is a data reduction method that could reduce all those face shapes to a single two-dimensional plot. And I plotted the ones where people liked the goggles in green and the ones where they didn't like them in red. And that showed that the green ones and the red ones were all mixed up randomly. And that was, you know, how I could communicated to them that, you know, that it wasn't going to work. So visualization is a very powerful tool, because if you've got a good visualization, the client doesn't need to know a lot about statistics to understand it.
Thank you. John, I'm going to bring you in at this point. Have you had a specific or a particularly bad experience to form your opinion?
Yes, a couple of ones directly come to mind. One of which was a report I saw from the government, or actually from the sub-department of the government, if you like, that basically stated that we needed more police. And it was a fairly substantial report. We're talking probably about 100 pages here. And all of the metrics were based around per 1,000 policemen, which is a very interesting metric. I mean, normalizing your crime rate per policeman. Unfortunately, this has the effect that the more policemen you employ, you actually get less crime per 1,000 policemen, even if they do nothing. So their conclusion was almost predicated on the fact how they analysed the data, which meant that the justification really wasn't valid. In fact, most of the report was based around that, so you could argue most of the report wasn't valid. What people in the general population are actually concerned about is crime, possibly crime in their area, rates of crime against them, their ethnic minority or whatever, but not crimes per 1,000 policemen. Was largely irrelevant to them. So the actual conclusion of the report that everybody seemed to accept, while may have been true, couldn't be concluded from the data presented.
A great example. Your line's a little bit crackly, but I think we caught the gist of that. Yeah, no, that is baffling what hill people are prepared to die on when it actually is irrelevant to most people. Thank you, John. A great question from Anthony on the chat there, saying, if the objective is to draw out the story that is not being told in the data that's already out there, then what are the challenges? I figure that probably all three of you might have something to say on that, but also we can have that as a wider conversation. So if anybody else wants to pick up on Anthony's point, please do.
Well, I'd like to mention a colleague of mine from the project I was just mentioning at Amy, a guy called Gary Short, has been doing some analyses on his YouTube channel, so look him up on YouTube, about how the Scottish government has been handling COVID-19. And so, for example, his recent one was about whether the recent change in policy about when schools should reopen was driven by data or driven by politics. And he basically analysed all the data that the Scottish government could have been using to inform the decision and found no change in it, no significant change in it in the time between when one policy was made and when they changed the policy. So from that, he concluded that it was most likely a political decision. In his first video, he wanted to see whether England or Scotland was handling things better. And one thing he did was he normalized the number of cases by population density, because of course an infectious disease spreads most quickly in densely populated areas. And while at first glance it looked as if Scotland was doing better than England, once you took population density into account, it was not doing as well as it looked. So again, choosing appropriate metrics is one way of finding things that people may not otherwise have spotted in the data and saying, well, what's going to be affecting this? How do we allow for that? And what, I mean, for example, the example of crime per 1,000 policemen, I mean, that is, the minute I heard that, I thought, what on earth is that statistic meant to mean at all?
Absolutely, and you know your point there about the storytelling around who's dealing with this pandemic as politically is something that all the world leaders seem to be fighting to kind of claim that crown, and I dare say not many that successfully. But it's quite interesting in terms of Anthony's question, you know, the story being told in the drawing out the story that is not being told in the data that's already out there. It seems, certainly from a political point of view, that the story we're supposed to be listening to keeps changing. Certainly as a kind of lay person, is it the R number, or is it these 5 tests, or is it this 1 to 4 rating? You know, I've no idea now what data signifier we are supposed to be looking at in terms of whether it's safe to do things or not. So that feels like a challenge in terms of the storytelling. Donna's put a good question I'm going to come to in a second, but I want to come back to you, Hedda, keeping on that health story. Yeah. Do you think, are there examples that you have come across where the health data shows one thing, but the story has ended up being something a bit different?
Yeah, so it happens a couple of times. So because, you know, different people, so once we get some output out of the data, or maybe my data scientist present his work, so we present in front of various people. There must be a financial director, there must be someone from other department. So they all have own perspective, right? So before presenting the result, or before presenting the data, as Peter mentioned, keeping a baseline or a reference to whom you are going to compare. So choosing the correct means a precise or correct metrics is very much required. So for example, you are saying that this has met, or you get this much number, but what is the comparison? Are you comparing with 100 or are you comparing with 1,000? So as we have, means yesterday there was a news in India that Prime Minister came at 4 p.m. and he said that we have distributed free food to the people twice the population of UK. But in India, the population is like, means 60, 70 times much, you know?
Yeah.
So to whom you are referring, the point means the baseline you are keeping is really important.
Yeah.
You know, so it's all about the art of a storyteller. That's a presenting the story is means you can present it in any way, but keeping a reference is very important.
Yes, that's like the equivalent of Boris Johnson coming out and saying, "We've fed everybody in Kent, so well done us." It's not a great prep for everybody. So Donna's question is: do the panel think there's any such thing as neutral data? Is data political, biased, toxic, problematic the minute it's created? That's one for all of you.
You have to look for bias in your data. I mean, my motto as a data scientist is never throw maths at a problem before you understand the data.
Exactly.
Yes, the most screaming example recently was the Apple credit card, which systematically gave women lower credit limits than their husbands, despite the fact that they had exactly the same financial history. You know, you have to understand your data, find where there are going to be sources of bias in it, and try to eliminate those sources of bias. I was quite interested when Bonamy was talking about a number of organisations that had pooled their data, because you were saying they were membership organisations, which meant that their data was coming from self-selected groups, meaning each individual organisation had a possibility of selection bias in its data. Therefore, pooling them could mitigate that risk.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was my misframing then. They went out to their audiences, so it was a single survey, but it went out to everyone's audience. So it wasn't pooled in that sense. But yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I had it recently where I think from a survey perspective, there's always that danger of, are you sort of leading the witness? So how you frame your questions are really important. I did a survey recently for one of the regional train operators, and they have a community fund, and they wanted to get their local community to vote on who the grants were going to go to. And we realized when building the survey that actually, because some of the charities had quite lengthy descriptions behind them, you had to keep flipping it every time, so it was randomized every time somebody was answering the question, because otherwise people sort of lose the will to keep reading, and actually the top three generally become the top three just because no one can be bothered to get to the end of the question. So I think there is that danger if you can lead the witness, and so randomization of responses, for example, is one way to get around that. Yeah.
Heather, did you have something to ask before?
Yeah, so I agree with both Peter and Bonamy. So means that the point is that measuring your sample selection bias is really important before making any interpretation, right? So this is one of my expertise in my PhD, and after that, I still continuing that there is a problem which is called data set shift in data science. You know, like before applying any machine learning or AI or data science, you should measure the shift in your data. So whether you have obtained your data in a biased way or not. And it's not just a single way of biasness. There are multiple ways, right? If we go into technicality, there are three possible ways. So input shift, that is covariate shift, prior probability shift in mathematics, which means obtaining the data in prior probability, means in prior information. So when you are applying, and then a concept shift. So the data you obtain based on what concept? Now your concept has changed and you are applying your knowledge back to the different concept. So this point is really important. So whenever you get your data, the first job of a data scientist or any policymaker don't get that data, but it's the job of a data scientist to check the data is suffering from any kind of biasness or not. It can be in any form. And there are methods to cope up. So there are methods to handle this type of data. And I believe a lot of machine learning scientists and data scientists are developing these methods. Means in you can fight with handling this type of data.
Great, thank you. John makes the point that even before that, forming a sensible null hypothesis is required, but that's not often stated. And I think that comes back to the point earlier, is that policymakers will often commission the data that they want to find to prove the point they're trying to make, rather than necessarily starting from a neutral position. Donna, though, can I bring you in and put the question back to you? Do you think there's anything such? Is there anything like neutral data? Does it exist?
I don't know, and I've got to say that the more data is one of those things that the more you learn about it, the less you realise you know. I seem to find, I was really struck by the differences in approaches, the differences in the data that all the panel are dealing with, and that's really, really interesting to me, because it becomes very hard to separate. It feels to me like it's almost like a background to political decisions or organizational decisions, rather. So actually it can be shaped to meet any of those objectives, but it's the framing. And I think you all talked about framing in different ways, didn't you? Whether it was about framing the questions or framing the metrics, and it strikes me that data is meaningless without that framing. So it can't be neutral, but I'm absolutely not an expert. It's so interesting listening to three different experts who are. I was interested actually about whether you recognise any similarities in the sorts of data that you work with, or whether you feel that actually data is so vast it's meaningless as a term, I guess.
From my perspective, I work with sort of smaller numbers than Peter and Hader. I'm going to hazard a guess. So because I'm not a data scientist, I'm not applying AI, and it's more anything that can be condensed on an Excel effectively. I suppose there's similarities in processes, but never in results, I suppose, in a nutshell.
Yes, I mean, I generally say that, that no matter what the application, I basically do maths.
Yes.
Yeah, and I've worked with a lot of different types of data sets from a lot of different types of clients, and it is basically a question of trying to find the approach that will make the data meaningful for them and hopefully solve their problem.
Yeah, it's all comes, and when we feed something, when we learn something, everything will land up into a numbers. So you have to align your numbers in such a way it makes sense. So that's why definition says finding the hidden pattern in the data. So that patterns are there. We just need to find either by rotating your data in such a way that you can see a pattern. That's it. But
actually, to that point as well, I often lead a client briefing or a new business meeting with, let's be clear here, we might not find a pattern, or we might not find a story, because quite often people are wanting you to find that hook that you can hang that marketing statement on, and it's not always there, and yes, we don't want to be accused of making it up. So I think that's equally as interesting sometimes, is having that discussion around, well, why isn't there a pattern, and what can we therefore build into our systems and processes to give us that story, to give us that pattern, and to give us that data that we can then gather and measure and build from. So again, defining the metrics, quite often people are starting from a point of not really having enough of it there to be able to measure.
And do you think that the neutrality of the data, or the perception of how you can trust the data, is so significantly linked to who's creating it, or where it's coming from, or who's paying for it, that almost invalidates then what comes next, because that perception is so strong? And example might be the tracking and tracing app saga that's happening at the moment, in that you've got the NHS one, which is being run by the NHS, but with some private sector contractors driving it. You've got the Google and Apple developed one, which seems to be kind of a bit more global. in its development. And then you've got the one, similar one from King's College London, which is academic driven. Certainly it's the kind of the symptom tracker. And all three, you know, I have no idea in terms of the relative merits of whether they work or not. Other people can say about that. But certainly in terms of the press coverage and how they've been talked about, a lot of it's been the conversation about trust and about whether, you know, is it right that, you know, are we happy now that Google and Apple are driving something like this, whereas previously we might not be happy with the sort of way they're using our data? Are we happy with the private sector involvement? Do we trust universities more? But is that fair? Is that right? Should that come into it? I'm interested to hear what people think.
Yeah, I mean, trust is, you know, trust and transparency are always important with data. I mean, one problem with the government's original app, I think, was that it was using a central repository, which was considered to be a privacy weakness, rather than a decentralized app, which I believe the Apple and Google system is, which is potentially why that system was thought more trustworthy, even though, you know, people don't generally think of Apple and Google as necessarily the most trustworthy organizations in the world. But it is, you know, it is knowing how it works that tells you whether you can trust it or not.
Great, thank you. No, I think that's a really interesting point. And John adds there on the chat that the data gatherers need to be very careful not to introduce selection bias. It's not an easy task. It requires a model to test against the survey data. Thank you for that, John. If anyone else wants to jump in on that focus on policymakers, I'd like to move the conversation now to thinking about in terms of businesses. And by businesses, we are talking about independent organizations. I guess this also includes, you know, charities and social enterprises and sole traders and so on. And the three things I want to consider is what tools help entrepreneurs to get their data understood by the right people. So data scientists and consultants is a tool. I'm not calling you a tool by any means, this is very rude, but in terms of a mechanism and you know, some expertise brought in. But what other tools help entrepreneurs to get their data understood? How can businesses work together to gather and aggregate data to influence policy? Draws a little bit on some of the stuff Bonami's been talking about. And what sort of data might be helpful for different types of businesses, I guess, in their quests to try and affect change. So again, gonna open this out, and if anybody wants to put a question in the chat. I'm gonna bring John in because you're very active on the chat bar. So the people at home seeing the recording won't see any of that. So I'm going to bring you in so you can ask yourself. Is that all right?
Yes, that's fine.
Over to you.
Sorry, I hope my audio holds up.
It sounds a little bit better.
Now, there's lots of questions here on how you make sure your data, if you like, data integrity is free, biased, and represents the population. And not only that, you've then got to, as I say, test ideally against a model. You have a model of society, and then you use that to verify your data, or verify the model represents the society you've actually got. That's not easy. And then, I mean, as far as the current epidemic is concerned, a lot of the models, like for London, the population, resident population may well be low. What you've actually got is a large amount of people coming into a central area every day and then going out every day on crowded public transport, which is a good mechanism for spreading the virus to a lot of people and then taking those people out to different parts of the country. it could be argued that London is a very sensitive region. Now, I did notice that the Mayor of London at one point said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up the congestion charge to just make traffic, reduce traffic. Unfortunately, that's again pushing people onto crowded public transport and therefore actually helping the virus spread, if you like, the wrong solution to the wrong problem. I don't know how he did his analysis to come across his conclusion, but it did seem rather odd that he was working in an antithesis of the government, who were saying, well, we need people off public transport. So again, you question whether these people are actually singing from the same sheet, or even using the same data, or processing the same data in the same way, seemingly are coming from opposite conclusions.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone want to pick up on that point? Donna adds in the chat room that instead of expecting the data to be trustworthy, as we were talking about before, is another strategy more to develop our critical response to it. So I think this has certainly come up in previous conversations. Is the quest now to ensure that we are critical thinkers from a very early age, and that's embedded in the way that we live our lives, rather than perhaps expecting the impossible, which is that data is bias free.
My personal view is that I would totally applaud that strategy. I don't think it's the whole solution. I think people being more sensitive to how we trust data, or indeed its presentation. We have to be aware of these problems, and if we're aware of these problems, we can take an appropriate educated view. If you're not aware, you just tend to accept the data as presented and not look or see the inadequacies in either the presentation or the acquisition of the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't just tell people these are the conclusions I drew from the data. You have to tell them this is how I drew these conclusions from the data. I keep saying the same thing over and over again, but you have to take them on the journey with you.
Anthony, would you like to? Am I able to bring you in? Are you happy to join the audio? You've got a great point to make there.
Yeah, hi there. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm, just to read out my point, I just think it's about how you can show that you've got a trustful position that you've taken to start from before you even start looking at what kind of data you're trying to show, and then what analysis and what story you're trying to tell. How can you, what conditions are there, what kind of how can you show that you've got good intentions, as it were, and that I'm not just saying I'm really tall for my height, something kind of completely bland and not doesn't have any stand up in the real world. You've got to have, how can you show you've got a good intention for what you're trying to say? Is there
And when we're thinking about it through the lens of kind of businesses then, and businesses being heard, and businesses that might have some genuinely insightful, transformational, they're sitting on something that's really important to share and to get in front of those that are making decisions. Do you think there's an inherent problem that because they are an independent business that might have a commercial raison d'etre or might have a particular value set, that it's hard for them to be able to show what that intention is, or to demonstrate that the data has some integrity, it has been critically reviewed, it is objectively useful and not just what they've necessarily produced. Is that a barrier generally for any businesses that want to share their data, do we think?
if I can respond to that, I think that for businesses, evidently there's always going to be at least the suspicion that they want to convey a message which is going to help them for their profit, and so therefore that that automatically goes out the window that they're going to be able to produce anything that can be trustful. But then I think what I'm thinking about is kind of organizations who have a kind of policy objective, who haven't really quite thought through what the kind of basis on which they're propositioning the users of their data. They're just having cliched kind of woolly thinking, and they're not really kind of deeply reanalyzing, rethinking what is the scope of what we're trying to do here, and how can we show what our thinking needs to show.
Yeah. Peter Bleackley and Hedda, you all are involved with private sector organisations to a lesser or greater extent that are trying to use data in a different way. What do you feel that there are inherent barriers there around their access to using it?
I think the times when I've come across, I think the point is about, if you're going to collect it, you've got to then act on it. And so I think often businesses are guilty of gathering the data, let's say employee engagement surveys, for example, and then being very slow to translate it and then to make actions and recommendations on the back of it. So I think the trust, therefore, is lost, and therefore the sort of so what of it all comes out the following year if you're trying to do the same thing, for example. So I think it's about responding quickly, being very clear about your timelines and why you're doing it. I think the why has to be at the forefront, and then making actions and recommendations that happen and that can be carried out on the back of it to show that it wasn't just sort of lip service, for example, to employee engagement surveys. It was actually to make change for good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would like to add one point that, for example, if you work with a healthcare organization, especially with NHS or maybe any public sector body, you have to rely on the data because you have to see whether what hypothesis or how the data is collected. Definitely we do that, but if you don't rely on the data, you can't make anything. It's up to you. First you have to model your question, and then you have to get the answer out of it. That is what we always do.
So to this question of tools then, what tools can help entrepreneurs to get their sort of data understood by the right people?
Tool, I would say, like entrepreneurs, like if they record their data, like they do their data, but some of the data is being not recorded, right? Like recording the data and keeping it securely, right? And these are the important tools. And tools like you need to pass your data to the right hand to make sense of it. Because, for example, if you have a data of your last 10 years, so the important point is this: what is your research question, or what is your question you want to get the answer it, right? So if you don't have a question, you can't get the answer. So the important point is, do you want to increase your sales? Do you want to increase your team? What do you want? And then you can answer it.
And do you think businesses work closely enough with academics? Because academics know how to do that. And then the number of...
before gathering or before doing anything, for example, we do anything. So what is the problem? Without knowing the problem, how can I tell you a solution? Right? So if somebody is sad, so everyone asks, why are you sad? So then we can say that, for example, I'm feeling sick or I'm feeling stressed. So then you can go back. So maybe you are stressed because of this, maybe because of this or because of this. Then you have to link it. And then you have to find a right feature that you are depressed because of this. So this is how in the data works. If you have a data, you have to find a question and then you can get the answer. It's reverse engineering.
One thing that I think is very useful for engagement with stakeholders is interactive tools. So if you show users some charts and say, this is what I've concluded, that's all very well. But if they can then explore the data themselves and ask it their own questions, then again, that builds up the relationship between you, the stakeholder, and the data that, that helps with that dialogue that we're trying to create.
Is that why we've seen the advent of dashboards?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Oh yes, I built a simple dashboard for my to help illustrate what I was doing with detecting faults in the traffic sensor network in the strategic road network a couple of months ago, and that really helped to sell that project to Highways England.
And before we kind of conclude, then I asked people earlier to put in the chat room whether you felt that you were sitting on some untapped data, or your organisation was sitting on some untapped data. Everyone that did reply was pretty unanimous and resounding in saying yes. So I invite anybody who contributed there to tell us what do you think is the data that you're sitting on that could change things that that no one's asking you for, and also back to the special guests, if you've got any examples of data you think is probably out there or could very easily be collected and could be an absolute game changer around a particular policy, but nobody is connecting up yet, or the people that have it are ignorant to it or actively withholding it. Heather, you seem to have a...
So can I say something?
Of course you
Yeah. So, for example, now these days a habit of people are, they used to express their emotions on social media, either through Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp status, these type of things, you know. So a lot of policymakers, what they are doing, they're keeping track of this free information which is available through Twitter APIs or Facebook API, and, you know, keep analyzing the things, and based on the information you have, you can recommend the solutions, right? So one of the possible solutions.
So using social media better to understand.
Means it's free, you know, you can monitor the Twitter live, right? But you have to give a quick, means if you are a small business, you have to give a reason why you are analyzing the tweets, right? And then, yes, you can do whatever you like. For example, if you are a small business within the local area, then means you can recommend your things over there based upon that.
And social media listening tools, you know, used to be big companies that only had the means to do that, like Clarabridge and Brandwatch and so on. But I think that they've become more accessible, haven't they? I think to smaller businesses as well, to kind of track how people are talking about them or how people are responding to their products and things. I mean, in the session last week, we had a filmmaker talking about a plug-in tool that they're starting to use with the promotional videos that they make, which analyzes quite a lot about the behavior and engagement of people watching the promotional videos of their clients. So you can tell how long people are watching for, are they getting bored, which bit excites them, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And one more example, I was talking to someone, means I recently bought a house, right? So the company I bought the house from, and I'm doing a project with them, right? So we were discussing, and they got an idea, like they have been told by some data scientists from our university that they were trying to outreach the people. So what they did, what they recommend that people who are visiting this new area, so they have either a smartphone by which your devices can access his IP address, or whatever way you can track that with this cell phone this person is entering into your area, maybe in this postcode, right, through satellites or whatever, means any machine. And then using tracking their machine, what they're doing, they are popping their SMS or email or Facebook advertising that, see, you came to this area, that means you are either intentionally came here to buy a property, we are here. Or if you are a broadband supplier, we are the good broadband suppliers. You means local businesses, carpenters, gardeners, means they can use a single information which you have tracked. You can sell it to others, which they can use to make a business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Bonamy, Peter, do you think there are gold mines being sat on and no one knows about it?
Well, I wouldn't say it's being sat on, but I don't think many people know that there is a feed of traffic data available from Highways England. It's called WebTris, and it's not the full data that we were using on the projects at Amy, but there is a publicly available feed that has traffic flow data at various points around the network at 15-minute intervals. So that's summary statistics. Again, that's called WebTris. So there are, quite a lot of publicly available data sets that are available if you look in the right place, but might not be as well known as they to many people.
Well, and the DRIVA project exists because of the access to Gatwick Airport's real-time proprietary data that the University of Brighton were able to negotiate, which isn't publicly, or not all of it is publicly available. So it's actually quite an exclusive and exciting new data set that anybody part of this project can apply to use and to work with. Just kind of flagging that again, I think universities and projects like this are a great entry point for people to be able to use data sets like that, but don't always necessarily know how to begin with. Before we conclude then, Bon, any points from you around data that you wish we had our hands on but don't?
I suppose I'm thinking about the education sector really, and how education can be using data better. Just from personal experience, partly with my two children, one of the schools that one of my daughters is at is beginning to get much better at engaging with all their different stakeholders and gathering that data to make decisions around loads of different areas, which amazingly wasn't happening a year or two ago. So I think there's a whole swathe of information that they could be using, and also in terms of recruitment, so where you're recruiting from, which schools are you targeting to bring people in, all that sort of thing. So that's an area that I'm sort of looking to explore more.
Yes, I think that is absolutely fascinating, and as well as a partner on this project, our team, or as possible, we do lots of quite big evaluation projects, long form evaluations with a number of partners, and we're working in some education spaces at the moment. And what still alarms me, or certainly is striking in 2020, is that the brief for the evaluation is still purely to measure the metrics of how many people turned up to something, or how many people were contacted, and that being a sign of success of something working, rather than actually all the stories behind it and what happened because of that, and what's the stories behind the data. And as an evaluation company, that's what we specialize in. But it's still remarkable how many big funded projects don't really particularly value that until you point out that that could be quite useful for their future decision making. But there we are. Okay, before we conclude, any other points or questions or kind of burning bits of wisdom that anybody from our illustrious guests or on the line like to offer? That we have another event in a couple of weeks' time that Donna, who's been contributing, will be one of the facilitators of. Working title, but drawing on that idea of Gatwick, or how you use transport data and visualization and engagement and storytelling. We're going to be focused on working with a number of really exciting artists, some of whom have been funded through the DRIVA program to do some real innovation on what you can do with data So do come along to that. Details of registration will be on the driverartsdriver.com website. Everybody welcome. But otherwise, it's my great pleasure to, my great pleasure to thank all of our brilliant speakers who've brought some great insights and wisdom today. So thank you to Peter, to Bonamy and to Hedda. And thank you everybody for coming along. If you haven't registered and explored with the driverartsdriver.com website, then go and do that. And more information about future events will be available through that. But tons of resources and other opportunities to connect with like-minded people. So go and play. So thank you all very, very much. Enjoy the rest of your week and speak to you very soon.